It's clearly an act of stupidity and cupidity to leak government emails which are market moving to a Wall Street moneymaker and pedo. But it is interesting.
The conspiracy theorists, maybe they were right.
Yeah.
There is a kind of global elite that acts with impunity, goes to depraved parties on yachts, that give each other backhanders and sensitive information. I think every single administration from John Major onwards has done something terrible to higher education. Sorry, I'm going to just rant now.
Please. And I remember a conversation with George Osborne, and he looked at me pityingly, and he said, "Do you want to be the minister who's introducing this tuition fee reform, or would you like the Liberal Democrats to?" Hello, and welcome to the Spectator's podcast, Quite Right. I'm Michael Gove, editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer.
And this week we'll be looking at the tangled toxic web that Epstein has spun, in which Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor and also, most conspicuously, Peter Mandelson have become entangled. What does it tell us about the world of politics? What does it tell us about the allure of the wealthy for the powerful?
We will also be discussing mounting anger amongst Britain's young people about the state of their student loan repayments.
And Maddie and I will be considering Britain's countryside. How can it be defended against woke warriors?
Last Friday, we were absolutely reeling from the release of the Epstein files. And since then, people have spent the weekend sifting through this enormous tranche of material. And it's damning for a great many rich and powerful people. One individual who comes across particularly badly from all of this is Peter Mandelson, who's resigned from the Labour Party. The latest batch of releases of the files contain emails suggesting that Epstein paid Mandelson $75,000, gave his husband additional money for an osteopathy course. And there is also suggestions that Mandy leaked a private email from Gordon Brown to Epstein, which contained highly sensitive market information and also seems to have divulged other highly secretive information. So it went from being, I would argue, a kind of tawdry friendship to potentially something more sinister, questions about, treachery to your country.
I think the initial feeling before, or just as the material dropped on Friday, the most striking thing was Prince Andrew. He'd hitherto been the principal focus of attention, and there's a slightly grotesque photograph of
Disgusting
him
picture.
Leaning over a poor prone woman. But then it quickly became apparent that even though there are more unfortunate revelations about the Andrew formerly known as Prince, that there are the far bigger story, and there are so many,
and probably more that we don't know about yet.
But the biggest was Peter Mandelson. Hitherto, the question of Peter Mandelson's judgment and Keir Starmer's judgment was front and centre. As you put it, was he nonce adjacent? Was he someone who, for whatever reason, was morally myopic in staying friends with Epstein after Epstein had been in jail? The case for the defence, I think, would have been that, well, Peter Mandelson believed that Epstein had been set up, framed in some way, and was inclined to give the benefit of the doubt to his friend, and was reinforced in that view because there were so many others who were also exercising the benefit of the doubt. Okay, you can decide whether or not that was a legitimate explanation and an act of misplaced faith in a friend or not. But the problem now is that whether or not Jeffrey Epstein was clearly a paedophile in plain sight, even if he had been guilty of a spotless private life, he should not have been in receipt of the material that Peter Mandelson sent to him. Because you say that, of course, there was an email that was sent from, what was clearly Gordon Brown's account, forwarded on. But there was a tranche of staff that, unless some, amazing defences entered, but a tranche of stuff that Peter Mandelson sent. Memos from Gordon Brown's advisors, Nick Butler and Shriti Vadera. And it's not just sort of high-grade gossip. It's also information which was market moving.
Absolutely.
Information about the sell-off of government assets, about what precise steps were being taken post-financial crisis in order to right the British economy. And I think the point's been fairly made that one of the pieces of information that was shared with Jeffrey Epstein resulted the next day in the American stock market, the S&P, rising dramatically. So it clearly would have given Epstein, whether or not he exercised it, a grotesquely unfair, arguably illegal financial advantage.
Yes.
And so that means that it's a much, much bleaker charge sheet against Peter Mandelson.
Yes. There's also, I think, an element where Gordon Brown seems to be gunning for Lord Mandelson, having famously not liked him much when they were in cabinet together. And he's now publicly revealed that he was kind of raising concerns. So this is quite a big problem for number 10, because, of course, Keir Starmer, who is now so desperate to avoid talking about Mandelson that he scuttled away from his China statement yesterday, leaving Darren Jones to pick up the flag, was so anxious to make him US ambassador that he announced Mandelson's appointment before he had been properly vetted.
Yes. So there were a number of people who issued warnings to Keir Starmer about the appropriateness of Peter Mandelson being ambassador. And the most conspicuous, I think, was the Labour peer Maurice Glassman. But there were also people who'd done this privately. I don't know what Gordon Brown, who, of course, brought Peter Mandelson back from obscurity to the cabinet in 2008. I don't know what Gordon Brown might have said to Keir Starmer beforehand. But after Peter Mandelson's resignation, Gordon Brown explicitly asked for an investigation into any material that Peter Mandelson might have shared inappropriately during the time that he was business secretary. I don't know exactly what prompted Gordon Brown to make that request, but apparently it didn't turn anything up, so we're told. And that's why the Conservatives, in the person of the indefatigable Alex Burghardt, the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, have been asking for a detailed investigation into when or which alarm bells were rung and whether or not these alarm bells having rung, Keir Starmer and others went ahead anyway. Because inevitably, as scandals like this develop or metastasize, it moves beyond Peter Mandelson's errors and it moves on to the faith or trust that others placed in him and the extent to which they either ignored or arguably sought to cover up aspects of Peter Mandelson's operation, the way in which they were either mistaken or myopic. It is the case that Peter Mandelson says that he shared everything that was relevant with Keir Starmer before being appointed. If that's so, that raises big questions about Keir Starmer's judgment and those around him. And whatever the truth of those claims about what was shared and when, there is an unfortunate aroma, a pong, now hanging over number 10 because of the Mandelson appointment.
For me, there was a sense that Starmer's government, despite having so long to prepare for the being actually in number 10, was short of ideas and unimaginative. And I think there was something comforting about the idea of having a key Blairite luminary in such a prominent role. When they're short of ideas, I've noticed they often go for Tony Blair round 2. So it's like, oh, we're going to close what we call loopholes around trail hunting, for example. We have to finish what Blair started. Let's have digital ID cards, this kind of stuff. And I wondered if there was an element of that where to have a kind of experienced lackey might have been an appealing prospect. But I think the things that had to be neglected to make that decision speak to a massive error of judgment on Starmer's part.
Yes, I think that the thing is that Peter Mandelson has what so many of the people around, not everyone, but so many of the people around Starmer lack, which is political guile and intelligence. And it may seem odd to mention political intelligence when it's clearly an act of stupidity and cupidity to leak government emails which are market moving to a Wall Street moneymaker and pedo. That is not the smartest move available. You don't need to be Metternich to appreciate that this is not a good idea. However, the thing is that in a desert, a thirsty man will drink even brackish water. And I think that Keir Starmer appreciates that Mandelson had some of the gifts that he lacked and that others around him lacked in being able to read the world. And there's a parallel, I don't know whether anyone would welcome this, with, someone like Richard Nixon, who was obviously the most disgraced American president ever, but at the same time had a reading of human character and politics. I mean, he made, of course, grotesque errors, which meant that he was sought out for the rest of his life. And so you can have someone who is both pariah and guru.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the stuff that is committed to email, I find quite astonishing. The release of these files, it genuinely, to go to American politics again, it would be like having all of J. Edgar Hoover's correspondence from 1963. It's astonishing that we have the ability to look through these things. And I'm quite amazed by what is just being committed to email all the time. Sometimes there's not even an attempt to cover up what's going on. People talking in very explicit terms about, for example, there is an email where Epstein says to Lord Mandelson, of course, we don't know the particulars. We hope that he's talking about, as my friend Tim Stanley wrote in his sketch, we hope he's talking about cigars. But Epstein says to Mandelson, have you decided yet, brown, Cuban, American? It's kind of extraordinary that such things are being said so explicitly. You think maybe there is some other back channel, but it just goes to show that there is a sort of hubris, perhaps, that comes with great power, a feeling of impunity.
That email raises a number of questions, which is probably not appropriate for us to explore on a family podcast. But the entanglement of so many people, including some notably pre-epic male politicians like Bill Clinton in this, does add another element to it. It's as though every potential element in the scandal can be there. There's even been, of course, invocation of potential KGB or Russian links. So it's almost as though you've had a team of Hollywood scriptwriters bring in every conceivable element of scandal. But it is interesting.
The conspiracy theorists, maybe they were right.
Yeah.
There is a kind of global elite that acts with impunity, goes to depraved parties on yachts, socialise together all over the world and give each other backhanders and sensitive information. I mean, this is kind of what the conspiracy theorists have been saying all along.
Yes, and I imagine that there'll probably be some people in politics, in the Labour Party or elsewhere, who thought, well, why wasn't I invited?
Are you sad not to have made...
No. But there'll also be other people who would think that is something I would never, ever do. So say what you like about Gordon Brown. I can't imagine Gordon Brown getting into a conversation with Jeffrey Epstein about, about anything, really.
Can't really picture Theresa May either, or Rishi Sunak.
Good heavens, no.
Nor David Cameron, really.
No,
I think he'd think it was all a bit grotty and sort of like Eurotrash jet set kind of thing.
I think Theresa May would have to have almost every single one of Jeffrey Epstein's emails explained to her, and I think that there would be moments when she'd drop her tea and because she couldn't understand or appreciate why on earth people would behave in that way. And I think you're right. I think David Cameron would regard it as the most vulgarly, inappropriately blingy, ridiculous escapade. But with Bill Clinton, he and Hillary, after initially being reluctant, have agreed that they will testify in front of Congress about Epstein's crimes. Peter Mandelson was interviewed earlier this week by our former colleague Katie Bowles for The Times. And in that interview, he said, look, I'm not going to speak to Congress. His crimes are out there. I don't think I could add anything. I think it's a mistake for him to say that, because I think that even though he might want this to blow over, the best answer for anyone who's involved in this, I think, is to share what they know with whatever it might be, with Congress or any other legitimate investigatory authority, because at the heart of the Epstein scandal are the victims of his trafficking, one of whom, Virginia Giuffre, is now dead, took her own life. And therefore, any of the people entangled in it might think, well, I wasn't directly involved in any of the most sort of grotesque and evil and wicked things he did.
But if you know something that might help,
yes,
you have a responsibility to share it.
Precisely.
No, it's absolutely true. And I just don't know if there's obviously more that has yet to be released. But what people have seen will only whet the appetite for further revelations, because what's out there is so astonishingly terrible. So I can't really see this going away. I think we'll be poring over the contents of these files for years to come, possibly decades to come.
And it's almost as though Epstein was designed by some AI superintelligence to be precisely the sort of sower of temptation to entangle everyone from, or to seek to entangle everyone from, Richard Branson to Elon Musk to Bill Clinton to Donald Trump to Peter Mandelson. Now, of course, many of the people who he sought to entangle either resisted the temptation or, following his disgrace, i.e. conviction, saw through him. But it is remarkable to think that this individual brings all of these people together. He brings together
It's
Andrew
astonishing.
Mountbatten Windsor, Sarah Ferguson, Beatrice and Eugenie. So many people within
them.
his ambit.
Yes, I know. And I have to say the whole saga with Fergie, Andrew and Epstein is just like vomit-inducing. The level of grift from her and depravity from him is just, it is quite nauseating.
Probably too late. I read a few weeks ago The Way We Live Now, sort of Trollope's arguably greatest novel. In it, the central character is a sort of Epstein figure, a
Yes.
financier called Augustus Melmotte. There isn't any lurid sex in it, but what there is the interplay of a marriage market and
Yes.
girls being essentially offered up as part of his own daughter, as
Yes.
part of sordid financial transactions. And then you have people from the beau monde who have status but no money, who are drawn to him. And Melmotte taints almost everyone with whom he comes into contact. There are one or two...
There are a few holdout characters
are.
who want nothing to do with it.
Precisely.
And at the end, there is a young couple who decide to go off and make something of their own in a
Yes.
new world rather than
Be associated
living
with
off
it.
the fat of the land.
But
But they all come to ruin, basically.
But the reason I mention it is that 150 years ago, the capacity of someone with forceful character, money, prodigious money, and the capacity to appeal to people's greed and vanity and lust was laid out in front of us. So the Epstein scandal is a reminder of human frailty and weakness in all its manifestations. So it might seem very 21st century in the fact that you have self-made billionaires like Musk and Branson ensnared in the web, that you've got what people would seem to think of as the post-ideological element of a centre-left politicians like Clinton and Mandelson feasting with Wall Street panthers. But actually, this is not to diminish or belittle the horrific fascination of it all,
No.
but it's a reflection of human weakness. And Peter Mandelson, in that sense, while his story is compelling and his fall is massive, nevertheless, he is also representative of someone, and the story's been told throughout time. I think it's part of the theme of Maupassant's Bel Ami as well, when you have someone of talent who is corrupted because of the glamour of the world around them.
In fact, actually, now you mention it, there are a lot of novels I can think of, like late 19th century, where there is this sort of moral panic about, not moral panic, I would say quite justified, but people speculating, trying to make easy money. It almost always rebounds on them in a terrible way. Like in Edith Wharton, it happens a lot where the characters speculate or borrow money, almost always ends badly for them. Maybe we have something to learn from that. But I think there are also questions about patriotism here.
Yes.
You have, for example, the possibility that Lord Mandelson may have divulged highly sensitive market information based on his privileged position, where you're being shown the most sensitive intelligence and it's being passed on. But you also have for example, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, there's one particular model of taking the privilege that granted to him through his position, using it to enrich himself, party basically, take everything that the world has to offer in every conceivable way and in a purely self-benefiting way. And then you compare that with, say, how other members of the royal family might conduct themselves. Compare that to Princess Anne or some of the minor royals who spend their time going around and opening up sports centres. And meanwhile, you have Andrew living in this kind of decadent, debased world.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's Andrew at one stage who seems to be suggesting that there should be some sort of investment in Helmand Province by Epstein, even as actually other members of his family, Prince Harry, were out there taking bullets.
God, yes. So I hadn't even registered that. There's so much to get.
No, and you're right. You can't really imagine the Duke of Gloucester, getting involved in this type of thing, or you can't really imagine Camilla Parker Bowles chance
No.
spending more than 30 seconds with someone like Epstein before smiling and retreating.
I sense that they would not enjoy Dubai as much as Prince Andrew appears to.
Certainly. I don't want to diminish Andrew's crimes and mistakes in any way, but again, it says something about the second son and the way in which the second son can sometimes feel. And this is something that Harry talks about in his own memoir in a very different way. I don't want to equate the two.
No.
But the sense that the focus and the hopes are invested in the eldest son, and then you are left feeling uncertain what your role is. Now, actually, you're in a position of amazing
Boo-hoo.
privilege.
George VI was a second son.
Well, quite. You're in a position of amazing privilege. I don't normally like using that word, but here there is no better description of it. Use it to serve.
Alongside that comes great duty and responsibility.
Precisely.
And Andrew has taken only the privilege bit and none of the responsibility or duty.
And the thing is that you don't need to live in luxury. The thing about any member of the royal family, or for that matter, any cabinet minister, is that you live in terms of comfort. So you're not at risk of indigence. So that's one of the corrupting
you're
things.
not a sheikh. You're a minor royal, and you should use that position to do things that benefit your country and support your sibling in the role that they have been born into.
Yes,
that's how it ought to pan out.
Yes, and in that way, I imagine you could think of Epstein as almost a sort of ethical barium meal going through the body politic, exposing those diseased organs and those areas that have become bloated, corrupted, or dysfunctional. It is undeniably the case that we will, I'm sure, that the world will return to this. And in this week's Spectator, our chairman, Charles Moore, explains why he's mentioned in the Epstein files as well. From the world of the uber-rich to those who are in the squeezed middle, student loans, student finance has become a neuralgic issue. And Rachel Reeves announced in the budget that the salary at which a particular type of student loan, Plan 2 student loans, must be paid back would be frozen at £29,385 for 3 years, starting from April 2027. The reason that this is significant is that what it does is that it creates an additional cadre of people who feel the pain of repaying really quite significant amounts.
Yes.
As I'm sure every listener will know, if you've taken out a student loan and you go into a high-earning profession, then you can pay it off, relatively, not painlessly, but you can pay it off. If you take out a student loan and you find yourself well below this or below this earning threshold,
yes,
then again there is relief. You're not on the hook. But if you're in the middle, then you find yourself paying escalating sums for more than most people I think would have expected to pay when they entered higher education. And I think that it's, in fact, I know that it is feeling a profound sense of unfairness, a backlash not just against this government, but against the whole system of higher education finance. And Maddie, I don't know if you think that my characterization of the victims of this, those people who are neither,
yes,
for the sake of argument, off working for hedge funds, venture capitalists, and all the rest of it, nor are they working for voluntary service overseas. But the vast sort of mass of people who've gone to university and invested in their education and are contributing in other ways, are they right to feel that they're being targeted unfairly?
Yes, they absolutely are being targeted unfairly. And it's also of a pace with other changes in our economy. Fiscal drag now means that a lot of people that would once have been considered probably lower or lower middle are now being taxed as if they were higher earners. But the punitive tax on graduates is particularly extreme. If you look at some of the marginal tax rates, it's something I've tried to raise in articles and on this podcast, I think. The marginal tax rates some graduates are paying are what you might expect for a very, very high earner. And it's often accompanied by perhaps less financial security elsewhere, not owning your own home, living in an expensive city where you're an economically productive citizen, but so much of your meagre salary that's not spent on servicing your student loan is going straight onto your housing costs. And the level of the interest rates on these loans is quite astonishing.
Yes.
I mean, I consider myself very lucky because I'm on Plan 1. I just missed the cut-off point. Plan 1, I think, is quite reasonable, actually. It's repayable. And again, as with the other form of loans, you don't start paying it at all until you earn a bit more. And then once you earn a bit more, you get a bit rinsed. But, you know, eventually you may pay it off, but it's not as painful. And of course, the amount you have to pay is not so great. But I have friends who earn really good salaries, really, like, on paper, extremely successful. And they have hardly made a debt into their student loan because of the amount of interest. I don't understand why students are being, I would say, gouged is the word I would use. I think we can have a small number of the most academic students go to university and it will be paid for by the taxpayer, which is how things used to operate. You cannot have the kind of high proportions of school leavers going to university and it remaining free. But you also can't fleece people with these interest rates. And you know, there are direct comparisons with the way that older people have been looked after. For example, during the coalition years, the triple lock comes in. Maybe it was necessary at the beginning, but the triple lock persists. And the way that they calculate the interest, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's using the RPI measure of inflation rather than the consumer price index CPI. So it makes it much higher. And it's the calculation that is not used for other forms of when they're calculating, for example, how much the triple lock goes up. So I think there's a kind of inbuilt inequity to it. But I don't think it's that surprising because every single administration from John Major onwards has done something terrible to higher education. Sorry, I'm going to just rant now. But, you know, John Major, it's under his administration, I think that the old distinction between the polys and universities is kind of dissolved.
Exactly.
So that's the first thing. Then, of course, Tony Blair comes in, wants half of all young people to go to university. Terrible idea. Obviously, this leads to a massive expansion of the sector and courses that shouldn't exist, probably whole institutions that shouldn't exist or shouldn't exist as the kind of academic setting that they claim to be. And then you have the coalition government coming along, trebles the fees and slaps the outrageous interest rates on them. So, you know, even though I'm not a left-wing person, I've only been on 3 protest marches in my life, but I did go on the one in 2011, the big one in London, because it just seemed to me, even then, outrageous. And the repayment terms have only got worse since 2011.
Just a brief historical footnote to higher education policy, which I must mention this week. Vince Cable was, of course, the business secretary who was responsible for introducing this system of tuition fees during the coalition government when I was education secretary. And you might say, well, Michael, if you were the education secretary, presumably your fingerprints are all over this. But they weren't, funnily enough. I'm not running away from it. I'll take my full share of responsibility in a moment. But the reason it was Vince Cable who introduced it is because when Peter Mandelson was taken back into government by Gordon Brown to be business secretary, he agreed to be business secretary, but only on condition that what was then a separate department for universities and skills and innovation and all the rest of it was subsumed. So he came back to have a bigger empire and to be first Secretary of State. Fast forward. The coalition negotiations of 2010, Vince Cable was going to be business secretary. The Conservatives had said that we were going to take universities away from the business department and put them back in education where they belonged. And I remember a conversation with George Osborne. And I said to George, well, you know, if you're going to make me the education secretary, which, you know, that's wonderful and I'm delighted and thank you, but surely university should be part of it. I'm not sort of empire building, it's just logical. And he said, oh, Michael, you've so much to learn. And he said, firstly, Vince will only accept the business department, or the Lib Dems accept the business department, if it is just as grand as Peter Mandelson's business department. Vince Cable won't accept any diminution in the scale of the business department. And I said, well, why are we giving in to the Lib Dems' sort of vanity and grandiosity on this? And he looked at me pityingly and he said, do you want to be the minister who's introducing this tuition fee reform? Or would you like the Liberal Democrats to? And then there was a Cheshire cat smile on his face. And I realized then that it would be the undoing of the Liberal Democrats to introduce tuition fee legislation when, as I'm sure listeners will remember, they had campaigned so vigorously before the 2010 election against it.
Yes, there was that weird summer where young people who were voting for the first time, and I actually missed the vote because I have a late birthday, but everyone else in my year could vote, basically. And some people kind of, well, they really felt like Nick Clegg understood
Well, yes.
them and was listening.
Well, and of course the question is, well, why on earth did the Lib Dems do it? And again, to be fair to Nick Clegg and the Lib Dems, they thought that it was important that they demonstrate that they were not a niminy-piminy party that would shy away from tough decisions. There's another analogy here. During the early stages of austerity, one of the things that funding was withdrawn from was an industrial concern called Sheffield Forge Masters, which was in Sheffield, where, of course, Nick Clegg was the MP. And he said, no, go ahead. I want my hands in the blood. I want to show that the Lib Dems are serious about making cuts. So you can argue that there was a certain self-sacrificing nobility about the Lib Dems, and they wanted to show at the time that they were grown up about power. However, it did for them, and it's left, or did leave for some time, a sense of betrayal. But actually, fast forward to now, I think the bigger sense of betrayal that's felt is by younger voters overall towards the entire political class.
Yeah, and I think they're right to.
Because a system of student fees or tuition fees was introduced. It's blanket. It was thought at the time that there would be significant variation, that elite institutions would charge more, other institutions would compete. But basically, the bill's pretty massive. As you say, the economic return, higher education is about much more than economics, but the economic return that degrees used to confer applies to a smaller proportion of degrees. And
by the way, I would argue, I completely agree, it's about knowledge for knowledge's sake. I would say the academic return, crucially, is also lower. The quality of these courses, the rigor of the courses, the fact that people who are maybe very skilled in certain areas have a lot to offer, but they're being sent down an academic route that's not for them.
I'll come back
and
to
probably
that.
people that shouldn't have been offered tenure now have tenure. You know what I mean? A whole sort of industry of second-rate everything now exists.
I am less vehement than you about saying that the expansion of higher education was a mistake. I think the way in which it was done was a mistake, but I might return to that in a sec. But I think overall,
that's interesting.
The sense of betrayal, of course, is compounded by the fact that all of this is going alongside the quantitative easing and money printing, which, as we know, contributed, along with a failure to reform the planning system properly, to the prices of assets rising, particularly homes, and housing becoming unaffordable for young people. So you're saddled with debt, and it becomes more difficult to acquire capital. And then on top of that, and again, it's quite a formidable charge sheet, and I can't escape my responsibility for some of these decisions, you have the 2 years of COVID. So if you were particularly an undergraduate during that time, an already blighted university experience is pulverized. So it is no surprise to me that you have a generation of people in their 20s now who look at all of the established parties and politicians with scorn and think, well, it's either Zach Polanski or Nigel Farage for me because you oldsters have screwed me.
Yeah. I mean, I personally do think the university expansion has been a terrible mistake. I think it's created a lot of the problems that we now see at British universities. No one likes to talk about this, but academia's dirty little secret is that there is pressure exerted on them to accept foreign students who pay higher fees, which has sometimes led to the dilution of standards. Often it's for things like master's degrees that are then used to cross-subsidise the other degrees that they offer, perhaps the higher quality undergraduate degrees. But I also think that you can trace a direct line between the creation of the student as a consumer who pays the fees to the kind of entitlement and snowflakery that you see on campuses. People feel they have a right to be safe, to be protected. And sometimes I think there's more pressure on the students to be passed and to be given good grades because they are paying to be
You're
there.
buying a student experience in the same way as you might buy a package holiday with an expectation that you're going to get all your whims attended to, rather than it being the proper experience of initiation into the best that's been thought and learned.
You're absolutely right also to talk about the political anger that is felt by younger generations. I mean, it's not even Rachel Reeves, when she was interviewed about this a few days ago, she didn't even try to pretend that it's not happening. She said in her response that she didn't think it was that unfair, what was happening, but also that these fees were being used to cut NHS waiting lists. So she's explicitly saying, actually, guys, you are just the great piggy bank. We will gouge you and make your life chances materially worse because we have to deal with the NHS.
Yes.
By the way, you rarely use the NHS, but when you do try to access it, you find it very difficult indeed. Because I even accessing the NHS it works against people that have a job. For example, you have to be on the phone at 8 a.m. If you have a job, you may well be commuting at the time that you might get a doctor's appointment, And so young professionals are kind of doubly screwed. They can't get an appointment and they have to pay for it.
And of course, all this is occurring against the backdrop this week of...
and also you're the only people that pay for the prescriptions. So many people don't pay for their prescriptions, but you're the mugs that do.
And resident doctors have voted again to go on strike this week. Again, some of those resident doctors will be complaining about the position in which they find themselves after their years of study, but also that contributes to NHS waiting lists rising. On the whole question of the purpose of higher education and how it might or should be funded, one thing I do think is that it is still the case that there are students out there, school students out there, capable of benefiting from a university education who are still in schools that are so poorly run that they don't get that opportunity. But, so therefore I think there is still a reservoir.
Which is outrageous.
Yes, there's still a reservoir of capable people.
But these people were once served by grammar schools that no longer exist.
There are many reasons why there are still students who've got the ability, and if they were in the right institutions, they would have the qualifications to go to university. So, but at the same time, it's also the case, and I think here you're right, that the university experience that's offered to many is counterproductive. My pat, trivial way of dealing with this would be to say that any subject that is taught at university with the word studies in the title should immediately be defunded and excised. So that there is literally, whether it's classical studies, peace studies, women's studies,
Peace studies at the University of Bradford is a classic, isn't it?
Yes. So yes. Any of these things, behind that cheap and meretricious shot is a broader point, which is that if you study maths, the physical sciences, or a rigorous humanities subject, history, English literature, that still adds value, provided it's at a rigorous institution. Whereas if you go for one of these other looser, vatic, free-floating degree titles, then it doesn't really add much value at all. Politically,
though, this, I think, creates huge issues for mainstream politics generally, because if you have what I think has been one byproduct of the expansion of the sector, which is elite overproduction.
Yes.
Young people leave university having been made certain promises about what their degree would do for them in their life, and then they enter what right now is a terrible graduate jobs market, and it has been made worse by some of the financial changes that the Labour government have made. But the jobs that they were promised no longer exist. But yet, having been to university, many will have, adopted a certain worldview
and expectations.
An expectation, and they were right to do so because they were made certain promises. And I think young people are being systematically lied to because it's incumbent on them and their fees to prop up some of these institutions that shouldn't exist.
I think without wanting to be unduly pessimistic, I hope I'm not being unduly pessimistic, you have the situation that you've described where you have...
It's so bad that people with really good degrees can't get a job at the moment.
So you have a cohort, a generation, where there are so many people who've gone to university, they've been sold the promise or seduced by the promise of a middle-class lifestyle with certain benefits that accrue in status attached to it. Many of them find that they can't get jobs commensurate with it, even if they're very highly qualified. Some people will have got those jobs, and so some people will now be working for magic circle law firms, consultancies, or whatever. But they're now going to find that their jobs are going to be under threat as a result of the march of artificial intelligence.
Yes.
So you have a growing cohort of people in their 20s and 30s, saddled with debt, who've become economic serfs, and very possibly economic serfs without any economic land to till, as it were, and against a background of low growth overall. it is a situation absolutely ripe for populist revolt.
Absolutely.
And you couldn't blame them.
Or I would say more left-wing politics as well.
Yes, I mean, by populist revolt,
as we've
I'm
been
talking
saying,
about both left and right.
Precisely, but sorry, I know,
Apologies.
but I think it's important because actually, I was saying about how the university sector has been kind of, I think, every administration that's come along has done something to make it a bit worse than how they found it.
Yes.
That means that the mainstream politics has its fingerprints all over the disaster. So people will naturally look for alternative solutions. But the people peddling these solutions don't have an answer either. What they would propose is probably the forgiveness of the debt. But who pays for that?
Yes.
How does the state, amid all its other responsibilities and massive balance sheet that we seem unable to cut in any meaningful way, how does it cope with that? I mean, I think it's a ticking time bomb. I guess that's a cliche, but it's kind of true.
Yes, there will be, as in so many areas, a terrible reckoning, because it's a literally unsustainable situation, and one where the pressure, again, because of the triple lock to which we're committed and an aging population, will mean that more and more resources seem to be transferred to the wealthy. So it will only increase, I fear, polarization and division in society.
There was quite an extraordinary story in the Telegraph in the last few days suggesting that Defra, the Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, has set specific targets for rural areas to become more diverse. What did you make of this?
Well, I think that once again, it's a displacement activity from what is central. So if you're thinking about the countryside, if you're thinking about rural areas at the moment, it seems to me that you've had a misguided attempt to impose unnecessary additional taxes on the farmers who produce our food and look after the countryside. You have a desire to have a trail hunting ban, which is an ideological jihad against remaining country pursuits. You've had a war on pubs, which was only alleviated at the last minute thanks to pressure from publicans themselves saying that they were going to ban Labour MPs. We've had the prospect of drink driving changes, which were designed to essentially render travel in rural areas increasingly prohibitive. And you've also, at this point, just as you've had all of these blows, you might argue that they're accidental, but now visible, directed at the countryside and its dwellers are now being told, you're racist as well. And I just think it's utterly misconceived.
There seems to be an obsession with making the countryside more accessible, is the word that they use, which I find rather curious. I mean, the countryside exists. You can just go.
Yes.
There are not boundaries preventing people from taking a walk in the countryside, but I find the language really interesting. It seems to talk about the countryside as a kind of like amenity, almost a vehicle for social change, a public good that should be conferred on the maximum number of people, which is how these people, these like stakeholdery type people in universities and civil service view the countryside. But it completely ignores the fact that what makes the countryside beautiful is the rich ecosystem of humans and nature that live there, and specifically the role of mankind over centuries of kind of taming the countryside and making it habitable. Like, it's not just a place for urban people to take a walk or go on a visit. But the language is so telling. It never considers that the countryside might be its own place.
Quite. I think that there are two bad things, but one hint of something almost understandably, beneficent behind this. What is that? Well, the bad things, fundamental misunderstanding of the countryside and the ecosystem. The other bad thing, a belief that unless every aspect of British life fits a particular template of numerical diversity, it's deficient. So unless the countryside mirrors the demographic map of the UK overall, it's racist. Unless profession X or institution Y mirrors that map, it's racist, which misunderstands the decision-making that people might make and the communities, the decisions that they might make about what they value. It forces everyone into Procrustes' bet. But the one area where I think that there is virtue, fugitive virtue, is the belief that we should encourage more people to better understand the countryside. So encouraging those who are educated in urban schools, who are living in urban environments, to understand where their food comes from, why natural capital matters, to value the fact that the countryside is different from, and its rhythms and its economics are different from urban life. That is a good thing. And if that means that, not in terms of regarding the countryside simply as an amenity that you visit, but as part of one nation, that I think is a good thing. And I might be being naive, but
I don't know. I think this is like a long-standing tension. I agree the countryside can be those things, but the reason it's beautiful is because humans in the countryside made it so.
Yes.
And right now we're up against real difficulty in all sorts of areas. Like the level of local government overreach, if you live in the countryside, is absolutely insane. My family live in the countryside, and the amount of nonsense that they've had to deal with, that there'll be some inspector coming around to be like, hello, is this field being used for something else?
Yes.
It's unbelievable. You cannot believe that the level of red tape. It's actually insane. I also think there may be a slight element of hangover here. I think that post BLM, a lot of funding was given to sort of new research projects. There's something called the Centre for Hate Studies, speaking of your dislike of studies-based subjects, at the University of Leicester, which was actually given significant funding to lead a project into what they call the Rural Racism Project, which seems a bit like a hammer in search of a nail. Like if you go looking for it, you will surely find it.
Yes, and if you want to, I'm sure you can find an 89-year-old in a pub in deepest Lincolnshire in the Wolds, whose views on multiculturalism might not be those of Sadiq Khan. Yes, I'm sure you can. But it is not the case that our countryside is from the Wash to Penzance, filled with hooded figures marching behind flaming crucifixes, looking for someone to lynch. It's absurd.
Also, it's not a right to feel welcome wherever you go. Like, there are many parts of the country where I don't feel particularly welcome, but who cares? That's on me. It's not for me to expect everyone to doff their cap at me wherever I go.
It is true that if you would go into the offices of The Guardian, York Place in King's Cross, you might get a frostier reception. That is true. And there are many others. But I think what I would want, I hope this is not too kumbaya, but what I would want is just a better level of understanding, so that we shouldn't force people in the countryside or in any part of England to conform to someone else's expectations. And part of that is empathy. And part of the empathy, I think, is that folk who are growing up in urban Britain should develop, if they can, or be given the opportunity to develop at least, an appreciation of the countryside. Because one of the things that is a long-term concern is that a progressive estrangement and alienation from how the countryside is managed, how our food is produced, what goes to make up rural life, will mean that precisely the sorts of bureaucratic creep that you've described, precisely the sorts of state overreach into the life of the countryside, won't be resisted.